In the dim confessional of a sleepy Montana town, a stranger's voice cracked the silence. "I'm not here to confess a sin, I'm here to confess a love." Father James, a young priest bound by vows, felt his heart race. That voice, low, raw, honest, belonged to Ethan, a man who stirred something dangerous in him. As whispers of scandal spread, their forbidden connection would test faith, love, and the courage to be true. Would they dare to defy the town's judgment? The autumn sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Catholic Church in Red Lodge, Montana, casting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden pews. Father James Brennan, 32 years old with gentle brown eyes and prematurely graying temples, adjusted his collar as he prepared for Sunday confessions. The booth smelled of old wood and decades of whispered secrets, a sacred space where the town's residents unburdened their souls. Red Lodge was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business before they knew it themselves. Population 2,200, nestled in the shadow of the Beartooth Mountains, it was a town built on ranching, tourism, and the kind of stubborn independence that defined Montana. The main street stretched for 6 blocks, lined with brick buildings from the mining boom days, now housing cafes, gift shops, and the Red Lodge Ale Brewery, where locals gathered to debate everything from cattle prices to politics. Father James had served this community for 7 years, ever since abandoning his promising law career in Minneapolis to answer what he believed was God's calling. His decision had shocked his family, Irish Catholics who expected him to marry his college sweetheart Sarah and give them grandchildren. Instead, he chose the seminary, trading courtroom arguments for Sunday sermons, corporate law for canon law. The confessions that October afternoon were routine. Mrs. Henderson admitting to gossiping about her neighbor's divorce, young Tommy Reeves confessing to stealing candy from Murphy's General Store, old Frank Martinez seeking forgiveness for his gambling losses at the casino in Billings. James offered the familiar words of absolution, his mind already drifting to his evening plans, reviewing his sermon notes, perhaps reading Thomas Merton by the fireplace. Then the voice came, low and unfamiliar, carrying an accent that wasn't quite local. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned, but that's not why I'm here." James straightened in his seat, the formal rhythm of confession suddenly disrupted. "I'm not here to confess a sin, Father. I'm here to confess a love." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. James felt his pulse quicken, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Through the lattice screen, he could make out only shadows, broad shoulders, work-worn hands clasped tightly together. "I'm in love with someone I shouldn't be," the voice continued, each word carefully chosen, deliberately placed. "Someone whose life I could destroy just by existing in it, and I think you know why, Father." James's mouth went dry. The confessional suddenly felt smaller, the air thinner. He knew that voice, had heard it asking about mass schedules, thanking him for blessing a jar of honey, offering to fix the squeaky gate by the parish hall. Ethan Crawford, the beekeeper who'd appeared in Red Lodge 6 months ago like a character from another story entirely. "I'm not asking for absolution," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "I just need to say it out loud in a place where truth is supposed to matter. I'm in love with a man who's given his life to God, and I know it's impossible, but pretending I don't feel it is killing me slowly." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. James wanted to speak, to offer comfort or counsel, but the words wouldn't come. His training told him to respond with scripture, with gentle redirection toward God's plan. His heart told him something entirely different. "Thank you for listening, Father," Ethan said finally, and James heard the soft sound of movement, preparing to leave. "Wait," James whispered, his voice barely audible, but the footsteps were already fading, the confessional door closing with a soft click that echoed like thunder in the sudden silence. Outside, Red Lodge continued its Sunday rhythm, oblivious to the earthquake that had just shaken James's world. Children chased each other through the church parking lot while their parents lingered in small groups, discussing the weather, the upcoming harvest festival, the new family that had moved into the old Peterson place. James remained in the confessional long after his scheduled hours, staring at his hands, replaying every word, every inflection of that confession that wasn't quite a confession at all. The following weeks transformed Red Lodge into a minefield of glances and unspoken words for Father James. Ethan Crawford had become impossible to ignore, not because he was trying to draw attention, but because James now noticed everything. The way Ethan's shoulders moved when he lifted heavy honey supers at the farmer's market, how his laugh carried across the church parking lot when children begged for samples of his wildflower honey, the careful way he chose his words when they inevitably crossed paths. Ethan lived on the outskirts of town in a converted barn on 40 acres of wildflower meadows. He'd arrived from Seattle the previous spring, claiming he needed a simpler life, away from corporate consulting and city noise. His bee operation was modest but successful, 12 hives producing enough honey to sell at markets from Red Lodge to Bozeman. He drove a weather-beaten Ford pickup, wore flannel shirts that had seen better years, and had calluses on his hands that spoke of honest work. The town had accepted him easily enough. Red Lodge had always attracted refugees from urban life, artists, writers, retired executives seeking authenticity in Montana's mountains. Ethan fit the pattern, polite but private, contributing to the community without demanding attention. He'd volunteered to repair the church's front steps, donated honey for the parish fundraiser, and somehow always appeared when heavy lifting was needed. It was during one of these volunteer sessions that James began to understand the dangerous territory he was entering. They were sanding the church pews one crisp October morning, the building empty except for dust motes dancing in colored light from the stained glass. Ethan worked methodically, his movements economical and sure. "Bees don't judge," he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "They just do their work, build their community, protect what matters. Sometimes I think they're smarter than we are." He paused in his sanding, looking directly at James. "They know the difference between what's natural and what's imposed from outside." James felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I suppose they have their own wisdom," he managed, focusing intently on the pew he was working on. "They accept what is," Ethan continued, "instead of fighting what could be." Their hands brushed when James reached for sandpaper, a contact that lasted perhaps 2 seconds but left both men frozen. James pulled back as if burned, mumbling something about needing water, and fled to the parish kitchen. The town's antennae, meanwhile, had begun to twitch. Red Lodge thrived on gossip the way its gardens thrived on mountain snowmelt, constantly, naturally, sometimes destructively. Clara Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who served on the parish council and considered herself the unofficial guardian of community morals, had begun to notice things. "Father James is spending an awful lot of time with that beekeeper," she mentioned to her sister during their weekly coffee at the Red Lodge Cafe. "Awfully friendly, if you ask me." "He's being neighborly," her sister replied, but Clara's seed was planted. The gossip spread in the way small-town talk always does, casually, conversationally, with just enough concern to seem caring rather than malicious. At Murphy's General Store while buying groceries, during the Tuesday morning quilting circle at the community center, in the pews before Sunday Mass began. "I saw them laughing together by the church steps," someone would say. "He had that beekeeper over at the rectory again," another would add. "Now I'm not saying anything's wrong, but..." Clara, emboldened by the murmurs of agreement, decided to take action. After evening mass on a particularly cold October night, she cornered Father James in the vestry as he removed his vestments. "Father, might I have a word?" Her voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to being heard. "Of course, Clara, what's on your mind?" She smoothed her gray hair, choosing her words carefully. "People are talking, Father, about you and that Crawford fellow. Now I'm sure it's all innocent, but appearances matter in a small town. The parish council is concerned about perceptions." James felt his stomach drop. What exactly are people saying? "Nothing specific," Clara said, which they both knew meant everything specific. "Just that you two seem very close, friendly, more than might be appropriate for a priest. I'm just looking out for you, Father, and for the church." That night, James couldn't sleep. He walked the rectory's small rooms, 3 bedrooms converted into his living space, study, and guest room. The building felt larger and emptier than usual, filled with shadows and the sound of wind rattling windows. He stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the lights of Red Lodge, scattered house lights forming constellations in the darkness, each one representing a family, a life, a set of expectations he was supposed to uphold. The betrayal, when it came, was swift and brutal in its efficiency. Clara had overheard Ethan joking with James about his preacher hands being surprisingly good for carpentry work, innocent comment about James's unexpected skill with woodworking. But in Clara's retelling, filtered through her interpretation and concern, it became something else entirely, evidence of inappropriate intimacy, of boundary crossing that threatened the moral fabric of their community. By the following Sunday, James could feel the shift. Eyes lingered on him during his sermon about love and acceptance. Conversations stopped when he entered the post-mass coffee hour. Parents pulled their children a little closer when he approached. The warmth he'd known for 7 years had cooled to polite distance. Ethan, sensitive to the change in atmosphere, stopped coming to church entirely. James found him one evening at the edge of town, sitting on his truck's tailgate, staring at his beehives in the fading light. "I don't want to make your life harder," Ethan said without preamble. "I never intended for this to happen." "You didn't do anything wrong," James replied, but even as he said it, he wondered if that was true. Had they crossed lines? Had his feelings shown more than he'd realized? In a place like this, intention doesn't matter much, Ethan said sadly. What matters is perception, and the perception is that we're too close for comfort. They stood in silence, two men caught between their hearts and their community, neither knowing how to bridge the growing distance between who they were and who they were expected to be. The crisis that would define everything came in late November, when winter's first serious snow began to blanket the Beartooth Mountains and Red Lodge prepared for its long seasonal hibernation. Ethan had driven to Billings to visit his parents for what he hoped would be a significant conversation, the one he'd been avoiding for 30 years. His parents, Robert and Margaret Crawford, lived in a modest ranch house in Billings Heights, surrounded by the kind of suburban comfort that spoke of middle-class stability and traditional values. His father worked in construction management, his mother taught second grade at a local elementary school. They were good people, church-going people, who'd raised their only son with love and expectations that now felt like chains around Ethan's heart. The visit had started normally enough: dinner at their favorite steakhouse, conversation about work and weather, and the relatives scattered across Montana and Wyoming. But when Ethan finally found the courage to speak his truth, the temperature in the room plummeted faster than the November snow falling outside. "Mom, Dad, there's something I need to tell you about who I am," he'd begun, the words he'd rehearsed for months suddenly feeling clumsy and inadequate. His father's face had hardened before Ethan even finished explaining. "I don't want to hear this," Robert said, standing abruptly from the kitchen table where they'd been sharing coffee and his mother's apple pie. "This isn't how we raised you." "You raised me to be honest," Ethan said quietly. "To be true to myself and to God, that's what I'm trying to do." His mother had tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of acceptance. "Where did we go wrong?" she whispered, looking at her husband rather than her son. The conversation deteriorated from there. Religious condemnation mixed with personal hurt, disappointment with disgust. When Ethan tried to explain about James, not the specifics of his feelings, but the search for connection, for understanding, his father exploded. "A priest? You're talking about corrupting a man of God. Get out of my house, just get out, you're no son of ours." The door had slammed behind Ethan with the finality of a coffin lid closing. He'd driven the 2 hours back to Red Lodge in a state of shock, the truck's heater unable to warm the cold that had settled in his bones. James found him the next morning, sitting in his truck beside the beehives, still wearing the same clothes from the previous day. The bees were dormant in their winter clusters, the hives silent under their blankets of snow, but Ethan stared at them as if they might offer some answer to questions he couldn't articulate. "They don't want me," Ethan said when James approached, his voice hollow with exhaustion and grief. 30 years of being their son, and it means nothing compared to this one truth about who I am." James wanted desperately to comfort him, to offer the kind of physical consolation, a hand on the shoulder, an embrace that came naturally in moments of crisis. But Clara's warnings echoed in his mind, along with the weight of watching eyes and wagging tongues. Instead, he stood awkwardly beside the truck, offering only words that felt inadequate. "I'm sorry," was all he could manage. "I'm so sorry, Ethan." The sabotage came 3 days later, swift and vicious in its cruelty. Someone had sprayed commercial pesticide around the perimeter of Ethan's property during the night, contaminating the winter food stores and killing half his bee colonies. James arrived to find Ethan working frantically to save what he could, his hands shaking as he moved hive boxes away from the contaminated area. The buzzing that had been a constant soundtrack to Ethan's property, the sound of thousands of bees working, living, building their community, had diminished to a mournful hum. Clusters of dead bees lay in the snow like dark punctuation marks against the white. "Why do they hate what they don't understand?" Ethan asked, his voice breaking as he cradled a frame heavy with dead bees. "These creatures never hurt anyone. They pollinate gardens, make honey, live in harmony with everything around them, but because they're part of my life, they have to suffer too." James had no answer. He stayed through the morning, bringing water, helping move equipment, bearing witness to the destruction of something beautiful and innocent. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them. Love, when it existed outside accepted boundaries, became a target for those who feared difference. The investigation that followed revealed the perpetrator, Dale Morrison, Clara's nephew, a bitter man in his 40s who'd struggled with alcohol and employment, finding easy targets for his rage in anyone who seemed different or threatening to his narrow view of how the world should work. He'd acted alone, but James understood that his actions grew from the soil of community whispers and sanctioned disapproval. Then came the call that James had been dreading. Bishop Michael O'Brien from the Diocese of Great Falls Billings had heard about the situation in Red Lodge. His voice over the phone was kindly but firm, the voice of institutional authority wrapped in pastoral concern. James, you're a good priest, one of our best, but this is a small town and small towns need their priests to be above reproach. I'm not saying you've done anything wrong, but perceptions matter. Distance yourself from this situation or we'll have to consider a transfer, possibly to a position where your pastoral duties are more limited. The threat was clear, couched in ecclesiastical politeness, but unmistakable in its implications. James could continue serving his community, continue being the priest Red Lodge had known and trusted, but only if he severed all connection with the man who'd confessed his love in the darkness of the confessional. That night James knelt in his empty church, surrounded by familiar saints and the scent of candle wax, searching for divine guidance that seemed as distant as the stars outside. The words of his ordination vows echoed in his memory: poverty, chastity, obedience. Simple words that had seemed so clear 7 years ago, now feeling like bars on a cage he'd built around his own heart. Meanwhile, Ethan faced his own breaking point. Standing in his damaged apiary, surrounded by the remnants of a life he'd tried to build, he realized that staying in Red Lodge meant continuing to endanger not only himself but also the man he'd come to love. The confession in the church booth had been meant as a gift, a moment of honesty that might free them both to acknowledge what existed between them. Instead, it had become a burden that threatened to destroy everything James had worked for. "I can't keep pretending I don't feel this," he told James during a chance encounter on Main Street, their first direct conversation in weeks. They stood outside Murphy's General Store, breath visible in the cold air, speaking in low tones while the town moved around them. "But I won't be the reason you lose everything. I've already lost my family, my bees, probably my place in this community. I won't take your calling from you too." The words hung between them like a bridge neither dared to cross, an acknowledgement of love that came wrapped in the promise of separation. The retreat center outside Bozeman sat nestled in a grove of ponderosa pines, a place where priests and seminarians came to refresh their spirits and reconnect with their calling. Father James arrived on a December morning when fresh snow made the world look newly created, carrying with him questions that had kept him awake for weeks and a heart that felt too heavy for his chest. The center was run by the Benedictine order, men who'd chosen contemplative lives dedicated to prayer, study, and the rhythms of monastic community. James had come here twice before during his priesthood, once as a newly ordained priest seeking guidance on parish leadership, and again 3 years later when a parishioner's death had shaken his faith in God's mercy. This visit felt different. This time, he wasn't seeking to strengthen his resolve or deepen his commitment to his vows. This time, he was questioning everything he'd believed about himself, about love, about the nature of service to God and community. Father Michael Santos, his old seminary professor and spiritual director, met James in the center's library, a warm room lined with theological texts and windows overlooking snow-covered meadows. Father Michael was 72 now, his hair completely white, his hands showing the spotted fragility of age, but his dark eyes remained sharp with intelligence and compassion. "You look like a man wrestling with angels," Father Michael said after they'd settled into chairs by the fireplace. "And from your phone call, I suspect the angel is winning." James had known Father Michael for nearly 15 years, had trusted him with doubts and fears throughout seminary and his early priesthood. But this conversation required a level of honesty that felt like stepping off a cliff. "I've fallen in love," James said simply, the words hanging in the air like smoke from the crackling fire. Father Michael nodded slowly, unsurprised. "Tell me about him." The lack of assumption, the immediate understanding that James was talking about a man shouldn't have been shocking. Father Michael had counseled hundreds of seminarians and priests over 5 decades. He'd heard every variation of human struggle, every conflict between heart and vow. James told him everything: the confession that wasn't a confession, the growing connection with Ethan, the community's suspicion, the bishop's ultimatum. Father Michael listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions that helped James clarify his own feelings. "Your vows aren't chains," Father Michael said when James had finished. "They're choices you made at a specific moment in your life based on your understanding of God's call at that time. But people grow, hearts change. Sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is acknowledge when our path needs to redirect. But my community, my calling, everything I've worked for, will survive without you if that's what God intends. The question isn't whether you can continue being the priest Red Lodge expects. The question is whether you can continue being the man God created, living honestly in the light of that truth." They talked through 3 days of winter quiet, walking the center's paths, sitting in chapel during communal prayers, exploring questions James had never dared to ask aloud. Father Michael shared stories of other priests who'd faced similar crossroads, some who'd stayed and found peace in their choice, others who'd left and discovered different forms of service. The church will tell you that leaving means failure, Father Michael said on James's final morning at the retreat. But I've learned that sometimes the most courageous act of faith is stepping into uncertainty when certainty has become a form of hiding. Back in Red Lodge, the town had been dealing with its own reckonings. Dale Morrison faced criminal charges for destroying Ethan's beehives, his actions finally crossing the line from gossip into illegal behavior. The court case forced the community to confront its own role in creating an atmosphere where hatred could flourish. Ethan, meanwhile, had made his own difficult decision. The attack on his bees had destroyed not just insects, but his ability to trust in the community's basic decency. He'd begun making plans to leave Red Lodge, perhaps return to the Pacific Northwest where his lifestyle wouldn't mark him as a target. But before he could act on those plans, something unexpected happened. A group of his neighbors, people who'd bought his honey, benefited from his volunteer work, watched him contribute quietly to their community, began to organize a response. Led by Sarah Martinez, Frank's daughter-in-law and a teacher at the local elementary school, they started what they called the Pollinator Project. What happened to Ethan's bees was an attack on all of us, Sarah announced at a town meeting held in the community center. Bees pollinate the flowers in our gardens, the crops our farmers grow. They're part of what makes this valley beautiful and productive. When someone attacks them out of hatred, they're attacking the foundation of our ecosystem. The project raised money to help Ethan replace his lost colonies and created a network of bee-friendly gardens throughout Red Lodge. More importantly, it sent a message that cruelty wouldn't be tolerated, that difference wouldn't be punished. Clara Morrison, shamed by her nephew's actions and forced to confront the role her gossip had played in creating the toxic atmosphere, publicly apologized to both Ethan and Father James. Her apology didn't undo the damage, but it marked a shift in the community's mood, away from suspicion and toward something resembling acceptance. It was in this changing atmosphere that James made his choice. He wrote a careful letter to Bishop O'Brien requesting laicization, the formal process by which a priest returns to lay status and is released from his vows. The letter was 4 pages long, explaining his decision not as a rejection of faith but as an evolution toward a different kind of service. The response came faster than he'd expected. Bishop O'Brien called personally, his voice mixing disappointment with paternal concern. "Are you certain about this, James? It's not a decision you can easily reverse." "I've never been more certain about anything," James replied, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. "And this man, this relationship you're pursuing." James paused, thinking of Ethan's confession months ago, of the courage it had taken to speak truth in the darkness. He taught me something about honesty, about the difference between serving God's expectations and serving God's love. The paperwork would take months to process, but James felt the weight lift from his shoulders immediately. That evening, he found Ethan at the church's memorial bench, a stone seat installed in memory of longtime parishioners, positioned to overlook the valley where Red Lodge nestled between mountain ranges. "I've requested laicization," James said, sitting beside Ethan but careful to maintain the distance that had become their habit. "I'm leaving the priesthood." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, studying James's face in the fading light. "For me." "For myself," James said firmly, "to live honestly, to serve God through truth rather than hiding. You showed me what courage looks like when you walked into that confessional. Now I'm trying to find my own." They sat in silence as the first stars appeared, 2 men who'd found each other across an impossible divide, finally able to imagine a future that didn't require them to choose between love and faith, between community and authenticity. Spring came early to the Beartooth Mountains that year, with March bringing warm winds that melted snow in rushing cascades and coaxed early wildflowers from the meadows around Red Lodge. It was during this season of renewal that Father James Brennan celebrated his final Mass as pastor of St. Mary's Catholic Church. The sanctuary was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the vestibule. The crowd included not only regular parishioners, but also community members who'd rarely attended services, drawn by curiosity, respect, or the simple human desire to witness a significant ending. James had chosen his final sermon carefully, focusing on the Gospel of John. "By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." He spoke about love as a bridge rather than a wall, about service that transcends institutional boundaries, about the courage required to live authentically in a world that often punishes difference. 7 years ago, you welcomed a young priest who thought he had all the answers, James said from the pulpit where he delivered nearly 400 sermons. You've taught me that faith isn't about certainty, it's about continuing to love and serve even when the path isn't clear. You've shown me that community isn't about conformity, it's about making space for each person to contribute their unique gifts. His voice remained steady throughout the homily, but those who knew him well could see the emotion in his eyes. Sarah Martinez dabbed at tears with a handkerchief. Old Frank Martinez nodded approvingly from his usual pew. Even Clara Morrison, subdued by months of reflection on her role in recent events, listened with something approaching reverence. I'm not leaving because I've lost faith, James continued. I'm leaving because faith has led me to a new understanding of how I'm called to serve. Love doesn't diminish when it crosses boundaries we've drawn. It expands to show us that our boundaries were too small to begin with. After the service, the parish hall filled with people sharing coffee, cake, and memories. James moved through the crowd, accepting hugs, words of gratitude, and a few expressions of confusion or disappointment. The conversation was warm but tinged with the sadness that accompanies any significant transition. Clara Morrison approached him near the end of the reception, carrying a paper plate covered with aluminum foil. "Apple pie," she said simply, "from my grandmother's recipe. I wanted to apologize again, Father, for everything." "You don't need to keep apologizing, Clara. We all did what we thought was right at the time." "No," she said firmly, "I did what I thought was safe. There's a difference. You're teaching us something about courage that I hope I can learn from." Outside the parish hall, Ethan waited by his truck, having stayed away from the reception to avoid complicating James's farewell. He'd watched the mass from the back of the church, slipping out before the final hymn ended. When James emerged from the building 2 hours later, Ethan was leaning against his tailgate, a jar of honey in his hands. "How did it go?" Ethan asked. "Better than I expected," James admitted. "Still hard. 7 years of relationships don't end easily." "They don't have to end, they just change." Over the following months, as James's laicization process moved through ecclesiastical channels, both men discovered the truth of that statement. James found work at the Yellowstone Gateway Museum, using his history degree and communication skills to develop educational programs for visitors. The work was different from pastoral care, but satisfying in its own way, helping people understand the story of their region, connecting them to something larger than themselves. Ethan rebuilt his bee operation with help from the Pollinator Project volunteers, expanding to 20 hives and establishing partnerships with local farmers interested in sustainable agriculture. The attack on his apiary had inadvertently created awareness about pollinator conservation that benefited the entire valley. They moved carefully toward each other, two men learning to navigate a relationship that had begun in shadows and secrecy. James rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, giving them space to explore their connection away from public scrutiny. They shared quiet dinners, long walks in the mountains, conversations that ranged from theology to beekeeping to their dreams for the future. The town adjusted with the resilience that characterizes rural communities faced with change. Some residents struggled with James's transition, missing their familiar priest and uncertain about his replacement, a young man fresh from seminary who brought enthusiasm but lacked James's deep knowledge of local personalities and problems. Others found inspiration in James's courage to choose authenticity over security. The children, as children often do, adapted most easily. They continued to wave when they saw James on the street, still brought him their scraped knees and playground dramas. When the new priest proved less skilled at fixing bicycles and building tree houses, they simply expanded their network of trusted adults to include James in his new civilian role. Dale Morrison served 6 months in county jail for destruction of property and was ordered to pay restitution for Ethan's losses. More importantly, he was required to complete community service hours working on environmental restoration projects, learning, perhaps for the first time, about the interconnectedness of the natural world he'd damaged. One evening in late summer, as the sun set behind the Absaroka Range and painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, James and Ethan sat on the bench outside St. Mary's Church, the same bench where their friendship had deepened, where James had first realized the impossibility of his situation, where they'd later imagined a future that seemed beyond reach. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked, handing James a jar of honey darker and more complex than his usual wildflower blend. "Leaving the priesthood, giving up everything you'd worked for." James tasted the honey, rich with the flavor of late-season asters and goldenrod, sweet with a slightly bitter finish that made it more interesting than simple sweetness. "I didn't give up everything," he said. "I gave up one way of serving God to find another. I'm still helping people, still trying to make the world a little better. The collar didn't make me a priest, the work did. And us, do you regret that? James looked at Ethan, this man who'd risked everything to speak truth in a confessional booth, who'd endured rejection and attack for the crime of loving someone society deemed inappropriate. How could I regret finding love? How could I regret discovering that faith and authenticity aren't opposites, they're the same thing approached from different angles? The church bells rang the hour as they had for over a century, calling the faithful to evening prayer. For the first time since leaving the priesthood, James heard those bells not as a summons to duties he could no longer fulfill, but as a reminder that some things, love, service, the search for meaning, transcended institutional boundaries. They weren't perfect, these two men learning to build a life together in a small town that was also learning to expand its definition of love and family. The world beyond Red Lodge remained complicated, often hostile to relationships like theirs. But in this valley surrounded by ancient mountains, under a sky vast enough to hold all kinds of love, they'd found something worth the risk. A home where truth didn't require hiding, where love didn't need permission, where service to others could take many forms. As summer deepened into autumn and the bees prepared for another winter, James and Ethan prepared for their own season of growth. They'd survived the storm that had threatened to destroy them both, learned that love, real love, wasn't about perfection or approval. It was about courage, the courage to speak truth, to change direction when necessary, to build bridges across the spaces that divide us from each other and from our authentic selves. In Red Lodge, Montana, under the watchful presence of the Beartooth Mountains and the blessing of endless sky, they'd found their answer to the question that had brought them together, not whether love was permissible, but whether they were brave enough to claim it when it appeared, unexpected and transformative, in the space between what was and what could be.